There's famously only 90 miles of ocean separating Cuba from the United States. Given their proximity, these nations should be sisters, but for the last 60 years they've been locked in a cold war of frozen hostilities, staring at each other on their tropical beaches with frigid resentment. Wounds from 62 years ago are still open, bleeding into culture, politics, ideology. On April 17th of 1961, 1,300 men would land in Cuba in the middle of the night. They came not from Miami, 90 miles away, but from a secret base in Central America, trained by assets of the Central Intelligence Agency. That night, both nations were ruled by young men, young in their rule. Fidel Castro struggled to keep his nation together. With the turmoil of revolution within and the chaos of geopolitics without, he was about to learn that the situation was even more deadly than he at first realized. Meanwhile, John F. Kennedy had taken control of America at perhaps the height of its global dominance, but also at a time where it had squirreled power away in a labyrinth of bureaucracy he had neither the patience nor the capacity to understand. And he was about to learn that his power as president was even lesser than he imagined. Neither leader wanted the invasion. Neither would truly benefit from it. In the long term, the invasion would do nothing but endanger the lives of the people of Cuba, then the Western Hemisphere, then the entire world. It was a stupid and tragic action that most at the top of the American government thought was hopelessly misguided, and yet they failed to stop a farce of an invasion that went even worse than anyone expected, because no one is competent.
It's good to have you here for another episode of No One is Competent, the show about why everyone in charge is worse at their jobs than you are at yours. My name is Jay. I'm a professional researcher and a student of history. I'm joined by my co-host Azalea, who is here to bring, well, I guess we could just say that he's a color commentator of sorts.
Yes, we got a lot of white that I'm staring at on my screen right now. Some blue and black. Those are the main colors of Google Docs. No, I'm here to bring the fun, baby. I'm the personality. I'm bipolar and I'm on the internet and I know how to talk, and those are my skills, Jay. Unlike you who know things and learn things, I just know how to be mentally ill into a microphone, and people occasionally find that it entertains them and makes them forget that they're rotting inside of their bodies.
Well, I mean, we all have our talents. But yeah, anyway, before we start, just a reminder that the show can be reached at noOneIsCompetent@gmail.com. That brilliant intro music was done by Sam Bryce. You can follow us on Twitter at Jaharis48 and at Azalea Wyatt. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube and review our podcast on Apple. If we get enough of those, Azalea will do a podcast while drunk on more alcohol than I've consumed in my entire life. And that's about it for announcements. Azalea, how are you doing for our 50th episode?
It's 10:38 Eastern Standard Time in the post-meridian. I am weird, beard, tiered, and unfortunately not even queered. But the show must go on. I'm not even going to make a joke about how long it's been since our last episode, because we did that last time, and frankly, it's passé. It's our 50th fucking episode, and this one is going to be great. I am going to manufacture content. I am going to become consumable. You are going to feast upon my intellectual flesh. in a communion of content.
Gotta get the little wafers ready.
I'm trying to set up, get back into the old online dating thing again, and like take new pictures of myself and figure that out. And well, you know, that's a great way to build your self-esteem.
Yeah. I mean, could be worse ways, I suppose.
I mean, I just feel like I'm not allowed to complain about being lonely if I don't, like, try to not be lonely, you know?
That's fair.
Jay, what is the 50th episode of our podcast about?
So the subject of this episode is none other than the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failed attempt at overthrowing the Cuban leader Fidel Castro by a paramilitary group created by the CIA. Now, our sources for this episode are The Bay of Pigs, Cuba 1961 by Alejandro de Quesada, The Brilliant Disaster by Jim Rassenberger, and An American History of Cuba by Ada Ferrer. Now, it would be impossible to properly cover the Bay of Pigs without first talking a bit about the Cuban Revolution that preceded it. Luckily, we did a whole episode on the Cuban Revolution, episode 49, so I'd suggest listening to that one first if you haven't already.
What's partially so fun about this episode is, like, you know, I tried really hard to keep episode 49 fun, mostly by interjecting with inane wrestling trivia, but, like, on a world historical stage, the Cuban Revolution is downright sleepy. Like, Jay, did more than 200 people even die?
I mean, probably yeah, when all was said and done, but like, not much.
More than
like,
300?
I don't know. It's a lot. I'm not going to talk too much about it at length, but it's one of those wars where like one side just loses their morale and just like gives up, basically.
Yeah, but it was not massively dramatic.
No, this is not Stalingrad.
No, and Batista was no grand villain.
No.
And Cuba was not on the world stage a particularly important nation, and yet Bay of Pigs today is like even if you don't know exactly what happened, like everyone's heard the name Bay of Pigs. It's like sort of one of those days that will live in infamy kind of things. And obviously we make a lot of allusions to the Cuban Missile Crisis that will eventually lead into, and to me, this event is so important to study because it kind of shows how a relatively small, botched military operation made by people who don't understand a situation politically, don't understand a situation militarily, can sort of domino effect snowball into a literal humanity risking crisis, right? And it kind of goes to show that such excitement and such insane chicanery can come from anywhere, any pocket of the world. And that's why I think it's such a brilliant lesson to study.
Yeah.
So to review, in late 1956, a dissident leader by the name of Fidel Castro landed on the southern coast of Cuba with around 80 would-be rebels, members of the so-called M26-7 movement. Now, Castro had previously been imprisoned and then forced into exile after a failed uprising against the Cuban government, which, again, at that time was under the leadership of military dictator Batista, with a first name I'm not going to pronounce. Castro's return to Cuba initially went poorly, with the bulk of his comrades being imprisoned by Batista's soldiers. But Castro and a core group of followers were able to escape into the mountains and spark a guerrilla war against the government. By mid-1958, the tide of the war had turned as Cuban army morale collapsed after a failed campaign against Castro's rebels. This paved the way for a lightning campaign by the insurgents, with cities falling one by one to their forces with minimal resistance offered. Faced with no other alternatives, Batista fled the country on New Year's Day 1959, and Cuba and Castro had won the Cuban Civil War. I guess the last thing I'll say about it is there's a surprising amount of cases. For me, the Russian Civil War comes to mind, where like a revolution happens and the revolutionaries are successful, not necessarily because they have like a popular uprising on their hands, but more because the government is just really, really unpopular. And so it's not that people like take up arms against it. They just kind of like sit on the sidelines and let it be blown over.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case for a while of Cuba.
So it's not that Castro himself is popular and his movement is popular. I'm sure a lot of people like it. But rather it's like, well, that guy sucks, so maybe we'll give this guy a try.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's it then, right? Castro wins, and in 1959, Cuba officially becomes a communist nation, right?
The communist nation we know and love today.
Yeah, but it turns out that's not exactly what happened. Now today, Fidel Castro is remembered as one of the most famous communist leaders of the 20th century. But at the start of 1959, it wasn't exactly clear whether he was communist or not at all. If you were to go back in time and ask Castro if he was a communist during the revolution, there's a fair chance that he would have told you no, especially if you ask him the question in English. Castro's movement, the M26-7 movement, was not styled as a communist People's Revolutionary Army or whatever. Cuba already had a separate communist party which Castro was not a member of. He did not outwardly advocate for a communist government during the fight against Batista, and he instead espoused his support for basic concepts such as liberty and democracy to foreign journalists, most famously Herbert Matthews of the New York Times. We talked a little bit about him last time. So Castro was to many outsiders simply a freedom fighter, no more and no less. The government setup following Batista's flight wasn't ostensibly communist or socialist either. Also, I'm not really going to go into the whole communist-socialist distinction.
Who gives a shit?
Yeah.
All right, look, I'm gonna be real. If you're listening to this and you care about the distinction between communist and socialist, you either care for one of two reasons. And the first group of people, I just don't care about the at all. The second group of people, like, listen, okay, brother, I get it. I love you, all right? I'm with you. We have a lot in common, but we just need to move on right now, all right? We're talking about other things. It's not important. You can talk to me about Maoist versus Hoxhaist thought later. It'll be fine, okay? I'll pretend to listen, but like for now, we're gonna do this thing, okay? Okay, all right.
Yeah, we'll hold off on the communism infighting episode, I suppose. But yeah. So, Castro is now the most powerful man on Cuba, but he doesn't immediately seize political control over the country. Instead, he chooses a liberal by the name of Manuel Urrutia Leo to be president. Leo, in turn, selected another liberal, Jose Miro Cardona, as prime minister. Castro remained in charge of the military, but for the moment the job of governing Cuba was in the hand of the moderates. So that being said, several of Castro's closest associates, most notably his brother Raul Castro, as well as Che Guevara, are openly Marxist. M26-7's calls for agrarian reform, social justice, and reducing the power of foreign interests also all came off as rather socialistic to many Americans. Thus, the accusation of communism was hard for Castro to fully dispel.
And of course, this is like not the height of the Red Scare that is past, but like suffice to say the average American is not looking to be super nuanced on, what separates communism from, sane social democracy and whatnot.
No.
Which is ironic, of course, because, like, this is also a period where in policy, and especially like what's going to happen domestically during, like, say, the LBJ administration, like, the U.S. is far more to the left in many ways than it is now, but politics is a fucking Gordian knot of donkey shit, and we're just gonna move on. So, in April of 1959, Castro was invited to visit the United States by the American Society of Newspaper Editors, resulting in a bit of a whirlwind tour of the East Coast. So, to be clear, at this point, Castro does not have, like, an official role in Cuban government.
So,
he's just, like, a guy.
I kind of skipped a little bit ahead in the chronology, just for the sake of the episode. By April, he is the prime minister, but he's not the president.
Okay. Yeah. So, like, he has a job, he has a salary, but in the eyes of the American people, especially because of media coverage, even before he became prime minister, he was like the face of the nation.
Yes.
Okay. So Castro was greeted pretty much everywhere he went by large crowds of curious onlookers, his rugged, charismatic freedom fighter look proving to be just as popular in the U.S. as it was in Cuba. While this was not an official state visit, Castro was provided with one of the largest ever security details assigned to a foreign leader at that point in time. The reason for this detail was simple. One of the things the revolutionaries had done once they took over Cuba was kick the mafia out of Havana. Given that the mob had previously dominated the casino industry in the city, let's just say there were probably more than a few people who were looking to take some shots at Castro. Given that this wasn't a state visit, President Eisenhower made a point of avoiding a meeting with the Cuban leader. Castro, nonetheless, did make a stop in D.C., where he was grilled by various senators, congressmen, and Vice President Richard Nixon. Nixon, in particular, lectured to Castro at some length about the dangers of communism, and came out of the meeting thinking that, quote, either Castro is incredibly naive about communism, or under communist discipline. My guess is the former. Which is actually, I mean, that's not dumb analysis.
Yeah.
Other politicians were more generous to him. Senator George Smathers, who had been a critic of Castro beforehand, claimed that he got the impression that Castro was a good man, while former Secretary of State Dean Acheson described him as the, quote, first Democrat of Latin America.
Now, it's around this time that the Central Intelligence Agency, or the Cuban Invasion Authority, as it would later be dubbed by some exiles,
cue the laugh track,
makes its appearance in the story. One of the CIA's first intelligence officers, a man by the name of Jerry Droller, was dispatched to have a lengthy one-on-one interview with Castro in his hotel room in New York. The German-born Droller had served with the CIA's precursor organization, the OSS, during World War II. But while he was an experienced officer, he had little knowledge of Latin America and could not speak Spanish. This apparently made him the ideal person to interview Fidel Castro, who was known for not really being that good at speaking English. Droller was also known for having, a particular liking of both alcohol and cigars. And when the meeting was done, he came away from it in a state of near intoxication, declaring to his superiors that Castro was not only not a communist, but was in fact a strong anti-communist fighter.
This kind of episode is exactly what I want our podcast to cover. Like, when we talk about incompetence, there's various types, flavors, shall we say. There's times where you ask a person to do something and they just fail. They just don't meet the mark. This is not that. This is just conceptually a bad idea. This is not just conceptually a bad idea. This is a conceptually bad idea that an 8th grader, a 13-year-old child, could tell you is dumb. Think about the power the CIA has. The billions of dollars of taxpayer money. If you're an American listener, your taxpayer money, the money that was taken out of your paycheck. This is what they thought was a good idea, to interview this dude with some cracker who don't even speak Spanish. Or know barely anything about Latin America. And he shows up completely hammered off his ass. Like, this is the best they got. This was their best idea. It feels fake. Like, it feels like it shouldn't have happened because real life isn't supposed to be this stupid, right?
Honestly, the 50s CIA as a whole, I might go into this later, it feels like this. You know, the CIA has always done, like, stupid shit every now and then, but, like, 50s CIA is one of the real heydays for that.
Yes, with an old-fashioned in one hand and sexually molesting a woman in the other hand, and just, like, tripping dick first into international conflict, assuming you'll do great at it because you were around while other people were winning World War II for you.
Yes.
All right, Jay, I'm done doing color commentary. You can get back to the education.
Anyways, Castro's U.S. visit had seemingly been a success, something that Castro was aiming for. He'd even hired a New York PR firm to help him craft his messaging during the tour. The extent to which Castro was lying to the Americans or being genuine in his assertions is impossible to fully ascertain, but it seems likely based on historical evidence that even if Castro was not an outright communist at this point, he did have strong communist sympathies that he downplayed while in the United States. Of course, subsequent Cuban historiography would portray Castro as a genuine Marxist-Leninist throughout the revolution and its aftermath.
Sure, honey.
It's funny, like, somebody even asked Che Guevara during the revolution if Castro is a communist, and he's like, not really. Yeah. So anyways, the success of Castro's US tour would prove ephemeral. Indeed, even before it began, cracks in the relationship between Castro and the US had already begun to form. You see, while Castro had initially supported the liberal government in Cuba, one the US kind of liked, he and his supporters soon found themselves at odds with the president and the prime minister. Following the revolution, Castro and his supporters took over the remnants of the Cuban army and began a purge of its ranks. Thousands of suspected pro-Batista officers and soldiers were given show trials, with many of them being executed. Even more would flee the country, forming the nucleus of an anti-Castro Cuban exile community. The violence of this process, which eschewed formal court procedures, upset many of the more moderate revolutionaries.
Of course, those more moderate revolutionaries were probably not the ones who were fighting the war, fighting against these guys, or maybe the ones who had their friends and family tortured by these guys.
Yeah, you know, this is one of these situations where it's like, yeah, these were show trials. This was not, do justice. Probably a lot of innocent people got killed. Also, Batista killed a lot of innocent people, and the Batista regime, just straight up killed tons of random civilians. A lot of these guys probably were guilty. So yeah, it's complicated.
Castro also advocated for slashing the high salaries provided to state officials, a holdover from the Batista regime. This brought him into conflict with Prime Minister Miro, who was forced into resignation in February of 1959, just a month after taking office. Castro at that point assumed the title of Prime Minister and began to sideline President Jago from power. It seemed likely that Castro still intended Jago to remain as a bit of a figurehead, someone whose presence would appease liberals in the US. This plan would prove unsuccessful. Jago frequently clashed with Castro on policy and publicly sought to distance himself from communism, which in turn brought him into conflict with the labor movements on the island. Castro sided with the labor unions, and Jago ultimately resigned in July 1959, just a few months after Castro had returned from the U.S. So for those of y'all keeping track at home, Castro not having full control over the nation lasts for about 6 to 7 months.
Yes. And from this point, for like the next like decade or so, he'll technically only be the prime minister, but he's in overall charge.
And there was never an election at any point for any of these guys mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, if your sympathies lie with the people who have been thrown out, that you should not. They were not elected prime minister or president. These were all pretend flim-flam titles. Now, following his consolidation of power, Castro began to ramp up the nationalization of Cuba's industry and agricultural sectors. While landowners were compensated for their property, which makes Castro borderline right-wing for the people that I run with, this move sparked more fears in the U.S. that Cuba was moving towards full socialism. For context, buying land and then redistributing it off of fruit companies is what got Guatemalan leaders declared socialists in 1956 and overthrown.
Yep.
So this is following a very well-established pattern. They weren't even, it was land the fruit companies weren't even using. Like, Jesus Christ. Cuban immigrants also fed into U.S. fears. One such individual, Major Pedro Diaz-Lanz, defected from the Cuban Air Force and testified to Congress that Castro's government was full of communists. This accusation was not without basis, as Castro had begun to install members of the Cuban Communist Party into various positions of power.
The 1960s would see further problems for Castro both internally and externally. An insurgency against his government broke out in the Escambray Mountains, which is kind of in central Cuba. These insurgents were led by members of the M26-7 movement who had become disillusioned with Castro for a variety of reasons.
I mean, you know, the guy's a dictator now. He's kind of like meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, a lot of them are like Democrats. Some of them are motivated by religion because Castro kind of secularizes education. And yeah, you also have like some like Batista guys joining up, but that's not as many. So the insurgency achieved some early successes, but Castro limits its spread by responding in full force. The Cuban government implemented a system of relocation similar to that used by the Spanish during the Cuban War of Independence, this being forcibly relocating civilians in troublesome areas into larger, more secure towns, and treating anybody who remains in those areas as an enemy combatant. This worked, and the insurgency made little headway, though small-scale fighting would continue until the mid-60s. Now, throughout this time, the US, is increasingly protesting all of Castro's actions, and this in turn causes Castro to turn towards the USSR for more economic support. In February of 1960, the Soviet deputy premier visits Cuba and opens up trade between the two countries. The US responds by ceasing the importation of Cuban sugar, and then the Soviets respond by saying, okay, we'll buy all that sugar and give you oil. Now, when American-owned refineries on Cuba refuse to process the Soviet oil, Castro nationalizes them. Throughout 1960, pretty much all remaining American property on Cuba is nationalized, with the owners compensated with mostly worthless Cuban government bonds. The thing with these bonds is that Castro says, okay, I'll give you these bonds, which will be fulfilled when we get money from the US for our sugar. And because the US isn't buying their sugar, they're worthless.
And remember, y'all, like we talked about last episode, for a long time, Cuba was an American colony, basically de facto. American businessmen owned massive parts of their industry and whatnot. And, you could very easily see this as the Cuban people taking back what should rightly belong to them, and the U.S. government getting concerned and wanting to retake what they see as their property.
Yes.
It's a turf war. Everything basically is. The dominating factor in U.S.-Cuban relations by this point in time was mutual paranoia. In 1959, it was perhaps possible that Castro's government could have come to an understanding with the U.S. Castro at that point was reluctant to throw in his lot with the Soviet Union, and Eisenhower wanted to avoid intervening in Cuba so as to avoid pushing them into the Soviet camp. But American reactions to Cuban policies pushed Cuba towards the USSR nonetheless, and the US's response made Castro siding with the Soviets an inevitability. You know, it's kind of a feedback loop. The more the Americans distance themselves and punish Cuba, the more Cuba has to go to the USSR for economic development, and basically just it's a cascade. In March of 1960, the French freighter Le Coubre exploded in Havana. Le Coubre had been carrying 70 tons of weapons, including grenades and ammunition, purchased from Belgium by Castro's government. The resulting explosion killed 6 French sailors and over 70 Cuban workers. Castro immediately accused the U.S. of being behind the plot, claiming that the U.S. was trying to deny Cuba the means to defend itself. The U.S. naturally denied any involvement. To this day, there's no solid evidence for U.S. involvement in the Le Coubre explosion. It seems most likely that it was an actual accident. That being said, Castro was not illogical for suspecting that the U.S. was covertly moving against him. Of course, broader students of Cuban history will note the irony of another ship in Havana exploding under mysterious circumstances that once again turned out to just be a fuck up because no one is competent.
Yeah. Also, just a fun historical note about the Le Coubre. If you know anything about Che Guevara, if you've ever heard his name, you probably think of the famous photo of him. You know what I'm talking about. That photo
is on the t-shirts.
That photo was taken in the memorial service, during the memorial service for the people who died in this explosion. So any hope of reconciliation between Cuba and the U.S. was seemingly gone by the end of the year. In January of 1961, President Eisenhower severs diplomatic ties with Cuba and implements a partial economic embargo on the island. By this point in time, planning was already underway for a US-backed invasion of Cuba. So we're going to step back a little bit, and if you know anything about the Bay of Pigs invasion, it's probably the fact that the CIA was behind it.
Yes, we did the Cuba is in the red corner, now in the blue corner. The Bois.
Yeah. And, the CIA's various exploits to rid the hemisphere of Castro and other communists are today quite well known. At the time, however, the CIA was a relatively young organization, one that was still finding its role in American defense policy. For most of American history, the CIA has not existed. It was and kind of still is relatively new. So the CIA is first created in 1947, built mainly as a replacement for the old World War II Office of Strategic Services. Now, the OSS had been under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Basically, it was created to coordinate actions between the various military intelligence agencies. But the CIA, on the other hand, will be a civilian intelligence agency. It's not a part of the military.
Pause. We can cut this, or if you don't know, but why? I ain't no lanyard wearing, boardroom meeting, McKinsey ass guy. But why not just have the military run the intelligence? Why do we need all these different agencies? What benefit? In my headcanon, I would guess that it's a civilian organization just because, the people who convinced Washington to create the thing and got funding for it didn't like the people who were in charge of the Defense Department and just wanted their own fucking toy. It's completely inefficient and wasteful and stupid and a complete fucking clown fuck of a time.
I think there's a moral argument to be made that, if you have these people whose job is covert intelligence and covert action, it's good to have a group like that under the authority of elected officials rather than kind of hidden away in the Department of Defense where they're directly reporting to generals. And okay, yes, technically the president's still commander-in-chief, but like it's kind of harder for the president, for the elected officials to keep track of what's going on.
And luckily, the CIA in its early years was, of course, very democratically controlled and transparent.
Yeah, in reality, civilian intelligence agencies around the world are often run by ghouls who are just as bad, if not worse, as their military intelligence counterparts. But yeah. A lot of it's also the British had their own MI6 and like, so American spies were like, hey, why do they get theirs and we don't have our own thing like that? Yeah. So during the late 40s and early 50s, the CIA doesn't really do all that much. They play a very minor role in the Korean War. They're basically not that important. Its first big success would come in 1953 when the CIA, in cooperation with British MI6, overthrows the government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. Now, in actuality, the CIA portion of this plan was almost a complete failure. Like, it almost was a disaster. But it did end up just basically causing a lot of chaos, and that paves the way for Mossadegh's resignation. Now, the Iranian coup, which was dubbed Operation Ajax, occurred under the leadership of Allen Dulles, who had been made director of the Central Intelligence earlier that year by President Eisenhower.
I'm not going to say definitively that Allen Dulles and his brother are the stupidest people to ever have an airport named after them, but they are, because, I don't know every airport that's ever been made by the human race, but, they are fierce competition.
The closest major airport to Dulles is Ronald Reagan, so got some competition there.
Oof. Okay. I'm gonna have to think. Yeah, you gotta break out like the pros and cons sheets on that shit. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So Eisenhower is on board with Dulles' plan for a more expansive role for the CIA. And that's something that Truman actually had not wanted. Truman was kind of right in saying that he doesn't want this kind of shady intelligence organization actually overthrowing governments and whatnot. So Dulles uses this almost accidental success in Iran to push for another coup. This one against the left-wing government of President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, as you mentioned earlier, in 1954.
The Guatemalan operation, which was given the code name PB Success, involved a small invasion of the country by a group of exiles organized and funded by the CIA in concert with a massive propaganda campaign. Radio stations operating near the border broadcast messages deep into Guatemala, talking about how the invading force was making rapid progress and how soldiers were mutinying en masse against the government, while airplanes dropped leaflets and small bombs on the capital. In actuality, the invasion was too small to succeed and made little initial headway, but President Arbenz was successfully tricked into fleeing from what he thought was a massive uprising. PB Success had been, a massive success for the fledgling agency. The CIA essentially tricked a foreign government into falling, achieving the U.S.'s objectives without the need for a costly invasion. Never mind the fact that they were going up against a man with basically no military experience.
Yeah.
And he kind of had a panic attack and folded.
Yeah. Literally like just a bureaucrat, basically.
Anyway, as we covered earlier, by 1960, the mood in Washington had turned solidly against Castro's government. The threat of a communist pro-Soviet regime just off the coast of Florida was not one that the U.S. would take lightly. An outright invasion of Cuba by the U.S. military, however, was off the cards. The U.S. still had no solid justification for such an operation, and it would risk pushing other countries to seek safety under the United Soviet Socialist Republic. Luckily for President Eisenhower, he had an agency that had shown itself capable of overthrowing foreign governments on a shoestring budget with little risk of American lives. Eisenhower set the CIA on the task, and in March of 1960, they came to him with a proposal titled, "A Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime." And it's worth making clear to be charitable, because I think it is important to be charitable in good faith when evaluating things, and this is a podcast about evaluating things and judging them. If the CIA could do what it promised to do, it would be good if, you were like an evil imperialist government, to be clear.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I mean,
like, if they could deliver, well, that sounds like a useful thing to have.
and they had delivered twice. And like, I was doing a little bit of reading about these other coups when writing this, and it's like, Iran and Guatemala are like a few bad rolls of the dice away of being no one is competent episodes. But, like, they worked.
I mean, Iran might be a no one is competent episode.
It might be, yeah.
Like, Iran, like, they tripped over their own dick, but they just happened to, like, roll a perfect D20 and, like, be great. Meanwhile, Guatemala was just, like, once again, just pure luck, basically.
Yeah. But, like, if you weren't looking at the details too much, you would be like, oh, yeah, like, hey, these guys are great. Like, they, with just paying some people off and dropping leaflets and broadcasting stuff on the radio, they can topple a government. Like, why would it again, if you want to do that, that is something you would do rather than sending in the Marine Corps. So at this point in time, the CIA's plan was focused mainly on aiding the insurgents already within Cuba. Remember, there's this ongoing insurgency in the mountains. The CIA would provide them with supplies dropped from airplanes. They would broadcast propaganda over the airwaves into Cuba, and they would train exiles in guerrilla warfare and covertly insert them into the country. As 1960 progressed, however, it became clear that such measures would not be enough to overthrow Castro. The Cuban army simply was just too powerful. It had contained the insurgency, and Castro's intelligence force had rooted out most of the opposition in the cities. This left one option: an invasion of Cuba by an external military force. So in August of 1960, Eisenhower approves of a budget of $13 million and the use of some DoD personnel and equipment for the training of a Cuban guerrilla force. Now this sets the ball rolling on what will eventually become the Bay of Pigs invasion. The man in charge of planning all this was the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans, Richard M. Bissell. Now, Bissell had made a name for himself by overseeing the successful development of the U-2 spy plane, but he doesn't have any actual military experience himself.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Now, with the president's approval, the CIA began to recruit for both a Cuban army and a government in exile. Our favorite German cigar enthusiast, Jerry Droller, is again dispatched to Miami, this time under the pseudonym Frank Bender. He's also joined by future Watergate burglar E. Howard Hunt. And they pose as wealthy magnates recruiting men for an operation to overthrow Castro. They claim to be in touch with other wealthy private benefactors, but the cover story was so weak that the men recruited into the program took to referring to their unnamed benefactor as Uncle Sam. Now, in spite of their poor cover story, the CIA was able to recruit a considerable amount of men for their cause. Waves of emigration following the fall of the Batista government, and then Castro's subsequent consolidation of power, meant that there was no shortage of exiles willing to join the fight against Castro. These men were sent to training camps that the CIA had established in the United States and Panama, and there they would join with Cubans who were already being trained as guerrillas.
And Miami being a haven for right-wing Cuban chuds is a long and proud tradition that continued for Czechs watch now.
So one thing to know actually is they do have a bit of difficulty making like a government in exile because these guys are a mix of basically Batista supporters and then opponents of Batista who supported the revolution, but then ditched because they didn't like Castro. And these two groups of people hate each other almost as much as they hate Castro. So they'll eventually select a guy, Manuel Artime, as the leader. He's not really super important, but yeah, it's not a super strong government in exile.
By September of 1960, the pro-American president of Guatemala agreed to allow the CIA to set up a training camp inside his country. Man, you overthrow Guatemala and then you use Guatemala to... Oh, this is like a fucking coup MLM. This would become the main gathering place for the CIA's newly created army, which soon took the name of Brigade 2506. Jay, why is it called Brigade 2506?
It's actually a pretty simple answer. One of the early members of the brigade died when they were out on basically like a training hike, fell off a mountain. And his serial number on his dog tag was 2506. So they named the unit in honor of him.
Ripperino. At this time, Brigade 2506 consisted of roughly 160 men. When all was said and done, it would reach a strength of around 1,500. The brigade soldiers were trained by Army and Marine veterans recruited by the CIA and were turned into a highly capable light infantry force. So these Army and Marine people who are trained them, they're not sent by the DOD. The CIA are finding retired Army and Marine vets and bringing them in independently of the DOD knowing anything about this.
Yes.
Okay, that's a very important detail. Of course, the CIA needed more than just their own private army. A Navy and Air Force would also be required. The air element would consist of 8 C-46s and 6 C-54 transports, as well as 16 B-26 bombers. I assume Jay understands completely what I just read, so I'll pretend that you do as well. These planes were officially sold to the Guatemalan government before being leased to the CIA. Everybody gets a cut. Their pilots would be Cubans trained by volunteers from the Alabama Air National Guard. Hell yeah! We're getting some inbred crap duster pilots to train people to fucking bomb Latin America. Jay, how could this go wrong?
How could it go wrong?
Oh man, this is great. The Alabama Air National Guard. Alabama Air National Guard sounds like a euphemism for like the pilot who like they won't let actually fly the plane yet because he keeps crashing the simulator. Like, all right, they were trained by volunteers by the brave men and women of the Alabama Air National Guard, which was at that time the last remaining U.S. military unit that was still flying the World War II era B-26s. These planes were crucial for the plan for a reason. The Cuban Air Force also flew B-26s. So the CIA planes could be painted in Cuban colors, and the pilots could purport to be mutinous rebels. Because remember, the plan is still, like, convince the Cuban people and the Cuban government that, like, a big mutiny and uprising is happening. Finally, to actually carry all the men to Cuba, the CIA purchased 5 cargo ships from a Cuban-owned shipping line that was sympathetic to the anti-Castro insurgency. The CIA would also utilize 2 infantry landing ships and an array of smaller landing craft that were directly owned by the agency. Jay, before you take over, I'd like to ask, so those C-46s, C-54s, and obviously there's B-26 bombers, that amount of planes, I mean, that's like some quick math. That's like 30 planes. 30 planes is a lot. Is that more than the Cubans had? Is that like a substantial air force, or is that nothing? I have no frame of reference.
So it's more bombers than the Cubans have. The Cubans have like 7 or 8 B-26s. The Cubans do have some fighter aircraft, which we'll get into later. These guys don't have fighters.
Oh, so these are all bombing craft?
Yeah, these are all bombers and cargo planes.
So they have no way of like really dogfighting,
No.
say, intercept. Yeah, this... Now listen, I'm just a simple country podcaster, but that sounds like it would be a problem.
This might be a little bit of foreshadowing.
Again, an 8th grader could point this out.
But yeah. So the concept of plausible deniability was a key part of Bissell's plan. This meant that US military personnel, planes, and ships could not directly take action against Cuba. This was ostensibly a solely private affair, even though just about everyone involved realized that the US was obviously behind the whole operation. It's like, they really, really want to pretend that, like, no, this isn't the US government doing this. It's totally just a bunch of random Cubans who have managed to put together, like, a ridiculously large military force for a private organization.
They're just really, really passionate. They got gumption. You gotta respect gumption.
As early as November, President Eisenhower kind of began to state his concerns with the CIA's plans. He questioned whether they would be truly sufficient and expressed his desire to have someone, most likely from the military, put in overall charge. The CIA avoided that, however, both to preserve a sort of plausible deniability for the presidency. Actually, it's kind of really hard for historians to piece together Eisenhower's role in all of this, because, like, a lot of this, like, doesn't involve documents being signed or whatever. Like, they're really trying to keep it so that, like, the president isn't super directly tied to this plan.
And I assume that the CIA burned a bunch of shit internally
yeah.
and, like,
It's probably also because the CIA didn't want to give up their pet project to the military. In any case, Eisenhower didn't really press the issue, and planning continued as he prepared to leave office and hand over the presidency to the newly elected JFK. Eisenhower's kind of role in this is, again, it can be kind of hard to puzzle out. A lot of times people are kind of confused as to why a guy who is very famous for overseeing the most famous amphibious invasion in US history, in world history, would be, like, okay with a really stupid plan like this. A part of it's probably, like, the plan wasn't really finalized by the time he leaves office. I think a part of it also might have just been, like, Eisenhower knew that at the end of the day, he would be presented by the plan, and if he thought it was dumb, he could say no. And he was the type of person who would say no if he thought it was not a good plan, because he had actual military experience. JFK does actually have military experience, but not as a general.
Also, something that's not brought up a lot with Eisenhower, but, like, the guy's 70 at this point.
Yeah, that is also true, you know.
Might not have been playing with a full deck of cards. I have literally never heard anyone, because, like, the senility argument, you know, people talk about both Trump and Biden now, very much in the news. Obviously, Reagan is kind of the go-to guy who is just cooked. And we've talked about Wilson, but I've never heard anyone mention the Eisenhower, but I mean, the guy was up there.
So John F. Kennedy's inauguration on January the 20th, 1961, initially meant little for the planned invasion of Cuba. Indeed, during the previous year's campaign, JFK had accused the Eisenhower administration, which obviously included his opponent, Vice President Richard Nixon, of being too soft on Cuba. JFK was briefed on the basic idea of the plan before taking office, and shortly after assuming the presidency, he ordered the Joint Chiefs of Staff to basically form a committee and review the CIA plan. Now, the JCS soon discovered that due to excessive compartmentalization, the CIA had no formal written plan. Nonetheless, they viewed the CIA operation as having a reasonable chance of success if the political developments predicted by the CIA came into fruition and if absolute air superiority could be achieved.
Wait. So this was just like in somebody's head?
Yeah. It's like on like a bunch of different notes on like different desks or whatever, but like there's no like big document like...
We're just doing vibe-based cues these days.
Yeah. So what do we mean by political developments? So basically, the CIA believed that their invasion force would spark a mass anti-Castro uprising. This is the return of our favorite greeted as liberators shtick. Yeah, quoting from a January CIA report, quote, "It is expected that these operations will precipitate a general uprising throughout Cuba and cause the revolt of large segments of the Cuban army and militia." Now, this was in spite of the fact that the earlier CIA report stated that Castro remained generally popular throughout much of Cuba. Now, the planning nonetheless pushed on, carried forward by its own momentum. This is kind of like a lot of times when you have these sorts of things, you've got a program started, you got all the people who have their jobs tied up in this program, and they want to see it into fruition, and like they're just going to keep on working on it and ignore anything that casts it into jeopardy.
Sunk cost is a hell of a drug, people. Hell of a fucking drug.
So in March, the CIA finally presents Kennedy with an actual invasion plan. Their target was the town of Trinidad, not to be confused with the country, Trinidad. So the town is on the southern coast of central Cuba, near the Escambray Mountains. Now, Trinidad was viewed as an ideal location for multiple reasons. It contained a dock where ships could unload cargo. It was a defensible area, as the main road from Havana to Trinidad passed over a single bridge that could be destroyed. And also, even if the landing force was defeated, the men could disperse into the mountains and join the insurgency.
Kennedy, however, rejected this plan. Trinidad lacked an airbase, meaning that it would be very obvious that any aircraft supporting the invasion were coming from abroad. Kennedy wanted a more quiet location and one with an airbase. The CIA went back to the drawing board and selected an area known as the Bay of Pigs, also on the southern coast but on the western part of the island. The Bay of Pigs had a nearby airbase that could be captured by the invasion force, and was decently defensible due to the presence of swamps surrounding the area. Castro's men would be forced into advancing through narrow bits of land in order to repulse any landing. However, the possibility of retreating into the mountains and joining the insurgency in case of failure was no longer a possibility, something Kennedy was not informed of. And you gotta remember, like, Kennedy gets into office, his brain is mostly on his sex addiction and his myriad health problems. He probably has a lot of domestic things he wants to do. And suddenly these fucking spooks are throwing documents at him about overthrowing the Cuban government. This was not his baby. And it was around this time that Kennedy began to have second thoughts. He told the basic details of the plan to the former Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and Acheson responded by calling the plan idiotic, stating, "It doesn't take Price Waterhouse to figure out that 1,500 Cubans ain't as good as 25,000. And 25,000 being the estimated size of Castro's force in the area.
Now, on April 4th of 1961, Kennedy holds a meeting at the State Department involving various top members of the executive branch. We're talking about Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor Mac Bundy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, etc., etc. The topic of the meeting was CIA's plans for Cuba. Allen Dulles and Bissell are also naturally present, and they present their case to the group. The only dissenting voice was Senator Fulbright. Fulbright, who had been personally invited to the meeting by Kennedy, argued that the invasion had little chance of success, and even if it did succeed, it would torpedo the US's reputation in Latin America and saddle the US with a potentially long and difficult occupation. When everyone was done with their arguments, Kennedy asked them all to offer their simple vote, yes or no. Apart from Fulbright, everyone said yes. The invasion would take place. Now, this meeting is kind of infamous for many reasons. One is that it's weird, you know. The president's job is to decide these things for himself. This is not like a regular procedure for the president to be like, oh, let's have a meeting of all the guys, and we all do a yay or nay vote on a military plan. You know, this was not obviously like a binding vote or anything, but a lot of people suspect that Kennedy, just because he has a lot of these doubts about the plan, is he maybe subconsciously kind of just removes himself from the responsibility by being like, okay, we'll have a big meeting and everyone will vote. And like, if everyone votes yes, then obviously it's a good idea.
I mean, on one hand, you can pitch this as a inexperienced ruler who does not have expertise on this subject, deferring to experts and his counselors. On the other hand, all of his so-called experts and counselors don't know shit about dick.
Yeah. And like, after the fact, pretty much everybody who's not in the CIA will be like, oh yeah, I totally knew the plan was stupid. But again, like, apart from Fulbright, they all said yes. And this in turn, this meeting will be used as an example of the phenomenon of groupthink. When the term groupthink is created, this is one of the things that they use. And it's the idea that when you have this big group of very like-minded people, a lot of Kennedy's cabinet are what I call like the new frontiersmen. They are these young Ivy League guys, all friends, all with a similar background. And they're all kind of getting on board with this idea. Nobody wants to be the dissenting voice. Fulbright, who's an outsider to this, Fulbright's like an old Democrat. During this meeting, they think that he's annoying. They view him as like this pompous old dude who's lecturing to them. And like, nobody wants to be the dissenting voice. And even if they have personal reservations, you hear a couple guys vote yes, and you say, okay, I'll vote yes too. And, they all end up giving their approval to the plan. There's also the factor of a timeline. Cuba is buying arms from the Soviet Union. It's rapidly militarizing. And in particular, they have big jets on order. And that means, like, if you wait a year, you're not going to be able to invade the country with what is basically like a World War II plus paramilitary in terms of equipment. You're going to need like the actual, US military to invade Cuba. So like, they're viewing this like, this is our last chance to do this whole like paramilitary shenanigans. Once, a couple months have passed and they're getting these MiGs, we can't do this anymore.
One final thing I'd like to bring up is that, like, this thing's exciting.
Yeah.
This is a time when James Bond novels are, like, hot and new and are, like, coming out. People are reading them. In fact, Jay, if you want, you can tell the story I'm talking about. But, like,
yeah,
everyone wants to believe that, we can just overthrow Cuba with this easy breezy force, and then the country is ours. They're thinking about the potential reward when they're not thinking about the potential risks. And again, most people couldn't have foreseen how badly. A lot of people knew things were going to go badly, but no one knew how badly it would go. And Jay, I'll leave you to tell the Ian Fleming story.
Yeah, so our favorite guy, Allen Dulles, happens to have been a particular fan of Ian Fleming. And
The guy who wrote James Bond, to be clear.
And got to meet Ian Fleming at a party in D.C. And when they're at this party, he solicits advice from Ian Fleming for how to deal with Castro, how to get rid of Castro.
And Ian Fleming is a guy. He's just a guy. He's just a dude who, I write novels. I write novels that have military shit in them.
I mean, Ian Fleming is a World War II British intelligence veteran, so he's not totally a nobody. But, like, Ian Fleming didn't really take Dulles, you know, like, Ian Fleming didn't think Dulles was being serious. Because, like, why would he seriously ask me for advice? And, like, he gives Dulles, like, some offhand, like, almost, like, joking responses. And Dulles comes away with it thinking, like, oh, like, this Ian Fleming's, like, he's a real genius. Like, I should get this more of his advice on other issues. Because he didn't get the opportunity for that, for reasons which we'll see. Another fun note is that one of the other guys we mentioned, E. Howard Hunt, who's involved in recruiting a lot of the brigade soldiers, was a novelist and wrote a bunch of, like, really, apparently, I've obviously not read them, but apparently a bunch of low-quality James Bond-style novels. But yeah, like you said, it's an exciting time. You know, this is a dynamic group of people. Like, these are, again, they're called the new frontiersmen. You had all these, like, young people who are viewed as geniuses. Like, they're brilliant. They're coming from the smartest minds in academia and private industry.
And this should tell you, ladies and gentlemen, about the smartest minds in academia and private industry. I don't think that's false.
Yeah. So anyways, Kennedy gives the go-ahead, and the order for mobilization comes to Brigade 2506 on April 9th. The plan, named Operation Zapata, was as follows. The brigade, roughly 1,500 men strong, would be split into three main bodies, which would land at 3 points in the Bay of Pigs, named Red, Blue, and Green Beach respectively. Talking about geography and, like, war stuff, I've learned is hard. Like, if you're watching on YouTube, we'll have a map. If you're listening to the podcast, I don't know, look up a map. Basically, if you take, you know, a sheet of paper, draw a horizontal line, the bottom half is the ocean, the top half is Cuba. Now imagine a little inlet, like a little triangle jutting into the landmass. That's the Bay of Pigs. And Red Beach is at the little tip of this inlet, so right at the tip of the bay. Blue Beach is not in the bay, it's just to the east of it, and Green Beach is further to the east.
So only one of the beaches is in the Bay of Pigs itself?
Yes. There is a town called Giron that's near Blue Beach, and that's, like, the biggest town in the area. We're also going to have paratroopers who are going to land further inland to secure roads and the airstrip. The Cuban leader of the brigade was Jose Pepe Perez San Roman, and he would command the force from Blue Beach near the town of Giron, like I just mentioned, after a beachhead is established. And a smaller force of around 160 men would actually make a preliminary landing near Guantanamo, which is on the far east of the island, a couple of days beforehand, to serve as a diversion. The idea was that, like, they would just kind of, like, land, you know, I don't know, set some things on fire and then leave, but it would draw Castro's men to the east.
Seems a little overly complicated.
Yeah, that was one of the criticisms.
All right, so April 14th, 3 days from go time. The fleet set sail from their bases in Central America on the night of April the 14th, 1961. Escorted by the carrier USS Essex. You have sex with the S. Essex. And her battle group. Almost immediately, the operation got to an inauspicious beginning when the force meant to make a diversionary landing near Guantanamo, which departed ahead of the rest of the fleet, spotted militiamen near the shore. Their landing was aborted and would play zero role in the upcoming battle. Now, the next day, in the morning of the 15th, 8 B-26 bombers, painted in Cuban Air Force colors, took off from the CIA base in Nicaragua and made their way towards Cuba. Once arriving over the island, they attacked 3 Cuban air bases. The Cuban Air Force at that time possessed 7 B-26s of their own, as well as 4 Hawker Sea Furies and 4 Lockheed T-33s. The strikes were a success, damaging or destroying over half of the Cuban Air Force. At around the same time, 2 more CIA B-26s made their way to Florida. Wait, what? Why are they going to Florida?
So yeah, this was another part of the whole plausible deniability scheme. And basically what the CIA did is that they took 2 of these bombers, took some of the panels off of them, shot a bunch of bullet holes into them, and then put the panels back on. And then they're like, hey, take these planes, fly to Miami and land, and claim that you are a Cuban Air Force pilots defecting from Cuba, and that you're the guys who bombed all the air bases and now escaped to the United States.
Did the pilots even speak Spanish?
Yes, these were actual Cubans. So all these pilots...
Right. But you understand how I could not assume that was true.
So all the pilots of these bombers at this point in time are actual Cuban exiles. A lot of them are from the Cuban Air Force or like Cuban Airlines or whatever, and they were recruited in. So their job is to pretend to be basically, guys who are just defecting from Cuba, like just today, and all the destruction is because like there's a big uprising. This is starting. So this kind of works. Like the press comes out and they take a bunch of pictures of the airplanes and they're interviewed and everything. And people are like, oh, like, mutinying pilots is, stuff going on in Cuba. So it's a big success. Adlai Stevenson even takes basically like a picture of these planes to the United Nations and it's like, this is what's going on in Cuba. And the Cubans pretty much initially accused the U.S. of being involved. And Adlai Stevenson at the United Nations...
Remind us who Adlai Stevenson is.
Oh, sorry. He's the Secretary of State. This famously will not be the last time a U.S. diplomat blatantly lies in the United Nations. But Adlai Stevenson actually had not been informed of this ahead of time. So he thought he was telling the truth. Unfortunately for him, the pictures of the B-26s showed a B-26 with a solid metal nose. And for most people, who cares? Airplane nerds kind of noticed that, wait a minute, the models of the B-26s Cubans have don't have a metal nose. They have a plexiglass transparent nose for the bombardier to see out of. So yeah, this was a blatant lie, and people caught on to that pretty quickly. But not fast enough.
The one time that that Air Force nerds actually affected domestic politics. Are you proud, Jay?
Partially, because even though like people who are in the know kind of realize this was stupid, domestically, like the fact that it was a lie did not spread quickly. So a lot of people are like believing in this. And as a result, Kennedy sees the success of this as like, okay, well, this means that we can't do further air raids. Because if the pilots bombed the air bases and escaped to Florida, if that's our cover story, well, we can't send them back to Cuba because then that's, the United States supporting a military operation from American air bases into Cuba. So Kennedy cancels the air raids that were supposed to take place over the next 2 days.
Oh, no.
Yes. So the air raids had been a success, but they had not destroyed the Cuban Air Force entirely. The Cubans still had 2 B-26s, 2 T-33s, and 3 Sea Furies. For a bit of context, the T-33 is a jet. The rest of these are all propeller airplanes. The T-33 is a jet trainer, but can be used as a fighter aircraft, and will wipe the floor with any of these other planes. The Sea Furies are also fighters. They're British, like, late World War II fighters. These are propeller planes, but they'll also wipe the floor with, like, cargo planes and bombers. So the Cubans still have fighters, and this means that Brigade 2506 would not enjoy air superiority.
Now, Kennedy couldn't necessarily know this at this point on the 15th. But he still, like, canceled all of her air operations.
Yeah, he canceled it because he, like I said, he thought that, like, you know, the cover story would seem weak if we continued air operations, which is a pretty significant flaw in the cover story that, like, you would think the CIA would have noticed beforehand. But, you know, whatever. And also, the pilots had reported back that, like, they had destroyed more airplanes than they actually had, which is a common thing in war. Kill counts for airplanes are often exaggerated. And Kennedy, I guess, didn't really question it and, like, assumed that they had destroyed more planes than they actually had.
So the following day, the 16th, represented the last chance for Kennedy to call off the operation. He could have ordered the ships turned around, leaving the air raid as the only action taken. Kennedy, however, stayed the course. The stage was set for D-Day. This is a classic case of something when things go wrong. You both don't commit and don't pull out at the same time. Now, Brigade 2506's flotilla reached the Bay of Pigs under the cover of darkness on the night of the 16th. After receiving and preparing all of its landing craft, the fleet split in three, its respective elements heading towards each of the planned beachheads, red, blue, and green. The first group to attempt their landing was an advanced group of frogmen from the 2nd Battalion. Quick, Jay, what's a frogman?
Frogmen are basically, they're kind of like SEALs. They're, you know, they're in their naval warfare special forces.
Their job was to land near Red Beach and install marker lights for the larger landing craft to follow. Intelligence had suggested that the area would be dark and most likely deserted. Much to their dismay, upon approaching Red Beach, the frogmen saw the area was lit up with spotlights from a nearby construction site. This is reminding me of the time Operation Eagle Claw arrests just a bunch of honest Iranian dudes trying to smuggle oil through the desert in the middle of the night. They made their way to a nearby area that was a bit darker, but upon attempting their landing, the group was discovered by a jeep full of militiamen. A firefight broke out, the first shots fired at the Bay of Pigs. That the first landing party was essentially immediately discovered was not just due to bad luck. Word had reached Castro that a U.S. invasion was likely. The whole recruitment campaign in Miami was impossible to keep secret, and he had prepared for it by stationing sentries along the coastline. The main brigade force under Pepe San Roman made its way to Blue Beach, reaching it around midnight. Their landing was initially more successful, with a small beachhead being established. Several soldiers drowned, however, as many of the landing craft struck reefs that had not been marked on maps prepared by the CIA. What could they, like, not swim?
I mean, swimming in military equipment's probably pretty hard.
Fair.
So yeah, with news of the firefights breaking out near Red Beach, San Ramon knew that the element of surprise had been lost, and thus he decides to cancel the landing at Green Beach. Those forces would be instead used to reinforce the main beachhead, which is Blue Beach. So don't worry about Green Beach, not going to be a thing. Now, in spite of the resistance they faced, the brigade frogmen at Red Beach were able to set up their marker lights and call in the larger landing craft. By 5 a.m., beachheads had been firmly established at Red and Blue Beach, but a new problem was approaching. Daylight meant that the remnants of the Cuban Air Force would be able to begin operations against the Brigadistas. Sure enough, Cuban aircraft began to appear in the sky shortly afterwards and began to make their attacks on the brigade fleet. The freighter Houston was hit by multiple bombs. Her captain beached the ship near Red Beach, which allows its soldiers and sailors to make their way onto the shoreline, but the Houston does eventually sink. Unfortunately for the brigade, the bulk of their medical supplies went down with the Houston when she sank shortly afterwards. Now, the second wave of air attacks came shortly after 7:30 a.m. A Cuban Sea Fury managed to hit the freighter Rio Escondido, setting it ablaze. The crew of the Rio Escondido was able to evacuate safely to another ship in the fleet, but the Rio blew up shortly afterwards, taking with her the brigade's first 10 days' supplies of ammunition, food, fuel, as well as more medical supplies. So yeah, very not good.
We haven't even been in the area for 9 hours.
Yeah, and they've lost 10 days worth of supplies. Now, in spite of these difficulties, the brigade was able to get most of its men and vehicles, this included 5 M41 light tanks, ashore. The paratroopers had also successfully landed, though they only managed to secure 2 out of the 3 roads leading into the area. The situation on the land, however, was highly chaotic. Many of the radios had been damaged by the salt water, making communication between the various elements very difficult.
Around 2:30 p.m., scouts detected a large column of Cuban soldiers and militia making their way down the road towards Red Beach. The Brigadistas, reinforced by 2 M41 tanks, managed to ambush Castro's men, killing hundreds and forcing the rest into retreat. All right, we got a dub. We're on the board. The Brigadistas managed to capture the airfield at Giron, but a lack of air superiority made moving in supplies difficult. The brigade's transports and bombers were sitting ducks for Cuban Sea Furies and T-33s. And to be clear, this is like, what, 5-6 planes? So
yeah.
there's like a dozen pilots just fucking these dudes up.
Yeah.
And they're just like one squad of guys.
Yes.
By the end of the day, 4 brigade aircraft had been lost. The fighting continued throughout the evening as Cuban Army artillery and tanks began to reach the area. Cuban forces, hindered by the fact they had to advance through narrow rocks surrounded by swamps, took heavy casualties. The road towards Red Beach was temporarily blocked by the wreckage of 4 Cuban Army T-34 tanks destroyed by the brigade. By the end of the day, the brigade was in a precarious position. They'd established 2 beachheads, but had lost 2 ships, 4 aircraft, and a large portion of their food, fuel, and medical supplies.
Now, the fighting on April 18th, the following day, was relatively more subdued, though still very deadly. Fidel Castro personally arrived in the area, leading Cuban forces in conjunction with the local commander Jose Ramon Fernandez. The Cuban army, having suffered significant casualties in their assaults on the brigade, took a more cautious approach, but this did not save them from suffering a further 1,800 killed and wounded when Brigade B-26s successfully attacked the Cuban column with bombs and napalm. Also, you know the whole, only Cubans are involved, no Americans? This kind of starts being ignored slightly because, a lot of the Cuban pilots are simply too fatigued to fly anymore. So at this point, a lot of the B-26s are actually flown by Americans. But yeah. So around 6 p.m., Castro's men began a large artillery bombardment of the brigade's position. The Brigadistas had little options other than to hold out and hope for resupply. Now, 3 brigade transport planes attempted to resupply the soldiers by landing at Giron airfield early on the 19th, but 2 of them were forced to turn back due to enemy fire. One made it, successfully delivering a small amount of supplies before departing. This would prove to be a futile mission, as shortly afterwards Castro's men began their final assault on the brigade. Now, the fighting on the 19th initially resembled that of the past 2 days. It was fairly even, But after a few skirmishes, the brigade's line soon began to collapse. Cuban soldiers and tanks pushed towards Giron, provoking Pepe San Ramon to send a final radio message to the flotilla stating, quote, "Am destroying all my equipment and communications. Tanks are in sight. I have nothing left to fight with. Am taking to the woods. I cannot wait for you." Both beachheads collapsed as the remnants of the brigade's forces attempted to make their way into the countryside. Which, is mostly swamps.
In the days following the collapse of Brigade 2506, the bulk of its soldiers, around 1,200, were rounded up and captured by Cuban forces. In total, the brigade had suffered around 104 killed, many more wounded. Cuban casualties are unknown, but likely numbered around 2,000 to 5,000. The Bay of Pigs was a huge military and political victory for Castro, who now formally declared Cuba to be a socialist country. The U.S. had been thoroughly embarrassed and was forced into negotiating for the release of its prisoners. Negotiations would not be concluded until after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when a U.S. lawyer finally signed an agreement to provide $53 million worth of food, medicine, and agricultural equipment, the money to be raised by private donations in exchange for the prisoners. The bulk were released on December 1962, though a handful convicted of crimes committed during the Batista regime remained in Cuban captivity. That's all we have for this episode. We'll probably cover the missile crisis in general, but Jay, before you go into your further analysis, I'd like to highlight just sort of the problems that I spotted let's sort of recap the laundry list of mistakes, shall we?
Sounds good.
So, first off, as mentioned by one of the guys, this didn't have enough people.
Yeah.
It seems like their dudes were actually pretty well trained, which is weird, honestly.
The brigade soldiers were very competent. They were very good soldiers, It is a well-known saying from World War I and also a name of a different podcast, but the whole idea of lions led by donkeys, I think, is very applicable in this situation.
Okay, but they didn't have enough of them.
Yeah.
So then you have, the switch up of Trinidad versus the Bay of Pigs. Obviously, there's that hilarity of them getting caught on the reefs and people dying because they just fucking hit some rocks. So, bad planning. Plan was too complicated. Do you think Trinidad would have been better?
So, this is famously seen as, one of, the big things that dooms the invasion. That being said, because Trinidad was a really good landing point, Castro kind of viewed it as a likely landing point. And as a result, the Cubans actually had 60,000 men in that area. So they would have faced more Cuban soldiers if they landed in Trinidad. My take is that if they had landed in Trinidad with the same lackluster air support, probably would have been a failure too.
So then you have their communications get damaged. Air support is obviously a huge thing. And I think the air support thing can be firmly laid at Kennedy's feet, but also the feet of all of his advisors and the CIA people who probably, to be fair to the guy, did not communicate the gravity of the situation to him.
Yeah. Reading this, the first time I read about Bay of Pigs, I was kind of frustrated at Kennedy because he makes a lot of stupid decisions. But then, you remember, Kennedy, is a military veteran. He did serve in World War II quite famously and heroically. But he's not a general. He's not an air marshal. He doesn't know anything about air campaigns. It's the job of the advisors to give him good information. And they gave him really shit information. And I think a part of it was that the CIA was really heading things up. And the Joint Chiefs were kind of on it. The military was given some ships and helping out. But ultimately it was like the CIA telling him what is and isn't possible, and not, a general or somebody. And not that the US military has never made mistakes before, but I feel like if it was somebody with more military experience advising the president, Kennedy wouldn't have made as many very disastrous decisions. The decision to scrap the air raids after the first one, it was a very poor decision. And, I don't want to say that the brigade would have won if he didn't make that decision, but it would have improved their odds quite a bit. Yes, in my mind, a lot of the blame, obviously very squarely lies on the hands of the CIA. You have a bunch of people who aren't military officers planning and running a military campaign. And they did so by making a lot of assumptions. And I think I've probably talked about them before in previous episodes, but making assumptions and factoring those into your plans during warfare is very, very dangerous. So what I mean is, obviously they assume that the Cuban people are going to rise up. That doesn't happen. The Cuban resistance movements had been pretty well contained by Castro. Castro arrested like tens of thousands of people before the Bay of Pigs, in the run up to it. Yeah, there was not going to be a mass uprising. They also made assumptions as to Kennedy's behavior. Allen Dulles would say years later that he assumed that once the beachheads was established, Kennedy would not see them fail. Kennedy would give any resources, including actual US military, personnel, to the plan once they got boots on the ground. And Kennedy obviously didn't make that call. Kennedy was willing to see it fail.
Because he was more concerned about the political ramifications stateside.
Yes. The CIA is making a lot of these assumptions, and, I think a lot of this is, Iran and Guatemala coming back to bite them, where Iran and Guatemala were successes due to a lot of things going in their favor, a lot of luck, basically. And in Bay of Pigs, the luck was completely on the other side. The lack of numbers is a big thing. 1,500 Cubans aren't as good as 25,000. And yeah, I think the final thing I just mentioned is the whole element of groupthink. The idea that you can have a kind of shitty plan that gets pushed forward because of this internal momentum. And when enough people get on board with it, then everybody else, nobody wants to be the dissenting voice. People just want to go along with it. Nobody wants to spoil the party. In a way, that reminds me a lot about the Japanese decision to go to war with the US in the run-up to Pearl Harbor. And actually, both of those are used as examples of groupthink by, I'm forgetting his name, but the guy who comes up with the term groupthink.
So, I think another huge groupthink is within the CIA and their, overconfidence.
Yeah.
In contrast to the guy who was ruling Guatemala, not the most accomplished dude in the world, but Castro was a military man who had been shot at, and, thousands of Cubans died defending their country, and it's yeah, they actually put up resistance because they were being invaded, and they were a military that were trained and knew what to do. And when you rolled in tanks, Castro was like, I also have tanks and I know how to use them.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how, obviously millions of dollars were spent and hundreds of people died, thousands more on the other side. But what's insulting to human life and dignity is in many ways the conquest of a nation state was treated utterly flippantly.
Yeah It's what I said earlier about 50 CIA, kind of in a joking way, being kind of just bizarre and just weird. This is almost what I call the hijinks era of the CIA.
It's a country club full of inbred Yale graduating weirdos.
Yeah, it's we're gonna prank our way into taking over a country with leaflets and pirate radio and shit like that. And It is kind of insulting that, this is what they came up with. And, you know, for the most part, none of them actually ever had to risk their own lives during it.
And this is why you should not trust your leaders. This is why you should not assume that the people in charge are good at their jobs, because they fucking sent this dude to interview Castro doesn't even speak Spanish. Like, it's...
Yeah.
And ultimately, I don't want to get, go on just a massive, political rant, but I feel like this can only be explained by, the overconfidence of empire. By just a state that won too much and is now, absolutely incapable of effectively evaluating risk.
Yeah.
And are so used to their own superiority, their own fascism, that they just, can't fucking see the forest from the tree. They can't see anything. And, it's really easy to oppress people in your own country that don't have arms and beat people in the streets and keep women down. But it's a lot harder to fucking go into other competent people's houses and take over their shit, even though you think you just kind of fucking deserve it.
Yeah.
And this convoluted mess of assumptions and cowardice and an utter failure to use critical reasoning skills, as well as put in the effort to fucking research where the reefs are and the beaches where you're going, is a perfect example of the No One Is Competent podcast, and it's half of the reason why we wanted to do this as our 50th episode. Jay, would you like to reveal the other reason this is our special 50th episode?
Sure. Well, the other reason is quite simply that this was our first episode, sort of. The first episode we ever recorded was The Bay of Pigs, and
episode 0.
Yeah, it wasn't that great, and we never released it. So, yeah,
not that great is, well. So we didn't know what the show was gonna be like back then, folks. We kind of we didn't plan well. We didn't coordinate well. I didn't have the script in front of me. Jay prepped everything alone. I was really tired during the first recording session. I was barely awake. I didn't know anything. I was interrupting you constantly. The byplay was not good. I was asking questions you didn't have answers for. You were leading me places, and I was skipping the cue of what we were talking about. And it was just a disorganized mess. I still have that episode. I should listen to it a little bit for nostalgia's sake. Will not be released. But, unlike the CIA, we know how to actually commit and try to put some quality into something. And over the course of 2 years, we learned how to work together. We learned a format. We're still iterating the format, as you heard. This episode started in a way we've never really started an episode before. And we got used to each other's flow. We got used to each other's workflow. And we worked out a system that was better through iteration. And I'm very proud of that. And I think this episode is great, despite my mild derangement. And I fucking love you, man, and I'm really glad we got to do all this weird fucking Giuliani and Custer's Last Stand of this, man. When we started this podcast, I was still a manager of a laundromat, man. I'd only written 2 novels. Now I've written 5, and I'm trying to get them published, and You were a college, like you were still in college when this started, weren't you? Or did you just graduate?
No, I had like just graduated.
Okay.
Yeah. And I guess it's pretty soon back to talking about French soldiers shooting Austrians in the fields of Europe.
Yes, we also have a bunch of episode like requests to get to. We have 2 big requests that we need to fill. So the next like 4-ish episodes are sort of spoken for until I have we have an idea probably in January or February will come out that I think is gonna be fucking supreme. Sort of a departure from previous episodes, but in a way that you'll like it. Anyway, enough of me babbling and whatnot. I have been Azalea. That is the glorious and the competent Jay. I hope that this episode has seen you well, and maybe sorta our schedules are better to release more consistently. Normally I only talk for myself, and I don't try to speak for Jay, but I don't even know if I can speak for myself on that, but things should be better.
Should be, yes.
So, God bless. And God bless you all. And y'all take care.